Welcome, everybody, to this week's podcast episode for the Financial Freedom Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Christopher Liu. And in that light, I'm always advocating for four pillars of freedom: time, financial, location, health freedom. And I'm always interviewing CEOs, entrepreneurs, people doing things on the cutting edge, changing the world for the better. And today we have Mike. He's also the CEO of Norhart. And Norhart is a $200 million apartment developer building high quality housing for 20 to 30% less by transforming the industry. Kind of reminds me of 3D printing of houses. So he's calling in from Minnesota. It's going to be a great topic about residential real estate, kind of the bread and butter for this audience. And it's going to be a great conversation. So, Mike, welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. I know, like we were talking backstage, real estate, that's kind of, very, I would say, established asset class. So tell us more about you, your company, and what you do.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. We design, we build, and we rent apartments, but we're transforming the way that's done by incorporating technologies and techniques that have really revolutionized other industries. And what that's doing for us is it's helping us drive down the cost of construction. And the powerful thing about that is I think by doing this, we can have a meaningful impact on the world's, or at least the United States' housing affordability crisis.
I mean, you hit the nail on the head for, real estate prices just gone out of the roof, especially with QE. We'll see what happens in the next year or so. And rent, housing prices, millennials, Gen Z can't afford homes. Home quality is terrible. Supply, things are and I love what people are doing to help address these. So we'll talk about big things. One is the one thing every real estate expert gets wrong. Tell us about that.
In real estate, it feels, at least in the construction world, because the cost of real estate, I think, is ultimately driven by construction. And I think in that world, what a lot of people get wrong is that they get kind of stuck in their ways. If you look at the past 60 years, manufacturing has improved labor productivity by 760%. Agriculture, 1,500%. Do you have a guess of what our industry developing out real estate has been?
I couldn't even fathom.
It's been 10%. It's been basically nothing. This is crazy. It's unsustainable. And it's a key driver of why home prices and rental prices have risen so much. And I think by changing the mindset and applying the principles learned in these other industries, we can really drive down those costs. But I think that's the biggest mindset change that has to happen in people, is realizing it is possible and that we can do it if we're willing to change our ways.
Yeah. So what techniques do you use to lower the cost of construction?
Yeah. So there's dozens of things that we use, but I'll give you one example. And that is that in construction, a lot of times the owner is different than the developer, who's different than the general contractor coordinating all the construction, who's different than the subcontractor, your plumbers, your electricians, your HVAC guys, who's different than your supplier and your manufacturer. What we've done is to bring all of these in-house. So we're the owner, developer, we're the whole chain, all the way down to we have our own precast concrete facilities where we generate these giant beams out of concrete and steel. But bringing all that in-house helps us reduce costs, for one, but second, it enables techniques that have been seen or been used well in manufacturing. For example, we take a project and we divide the whole thing out into smaller chunks. Maybe that's a unit. It might be down to a half unit. Then what we're doing is we give our teams only a few hours. Right now it's 5 hours to complete their work in that unit. That means that every 5 hours, we produce a new apartment unit. And just by doing that, it lets us condense the work down in a way that's untraditional in construction. We can take an 18-month project and drop it down to 9 months.
And one thing, because I had a couple of my units remodeled, and one thing is coordination. And there's always with construction, because you're dealing with people and regulate, all these. How do you how do you coordinate all of these things? Like sometimes they need more, you don't have labor, you don't have parts, you need more parts, you can't get the permits, something's always going wrong in construction. So tell us how you mitigate those type of factors.
Yeah, to expound on your point first, like imagine if the construction industry produced cars. You'd have somebody different doing the wheels, someone different doing the windshield, and someone different doing the door. And then the door company would say, sorry, I can't get here this week. And then you would tell them, I want you to work on one car at a time. They would throw up their hands and say, there's no way, I need 100 cars. I'm coming in there and I'm walking out, right? So you solve that problem in large part by bringing those teams in-house, but that's not enough because a lot of construction people have an old way of thinking. And there's a culture in the construction world that's stereotypically not super positive, not super engaging. And so we spend a lot of time and attention on hiring the right people and building the right culture. In fact, 5% of the staff in our company are recruiters because we're fighting to find people who are literally best in the world of what they do. And when you bring people of that caliber together, they're excited to change the way work is done and to solve those very issues you're talking about.
Interesting. And it reminds me of what Bezos did with Amazon. Now he has his own, he basically cut out FedEx and UPS and he has his own.
Exactly.
And plus, with robots and AI, I'm not saying to replace labor workers, but, this is kind of where the trends are going. And one thing that's really on my mind is where does 3D printing fit into all of this construction or on-demand printing and all of that?
It's really interesting because the world of the media jumps on the most exciting new features or what have you. And 3D printing is one piece of that puzzle, but there are dozens of more mundane, less exciting things that make a bigger impact than something like 3D printing. But 3D printing is something we're carefully watching. And in some ways, we do things that feel a little bit like 3D printing. Like we have robotics that build out a wall, and it's a fully completed exterior wall. And then they drop it in place on our buildings like Lego blocks. And so, we don't develop that on site, but it's being developed through the factory. And but I think 3D printing has a place, and we will likely utilize some of that technology in the future.
Yeah. Before we get into sort of the macro landscape with interest rates and all of that, I have some other questions. Is you have some of the quote best advice for real estate development that is rarely followed. Tell us more about that.
I think the thing that is I think real estate developers don't want to get into construction, right? So that's someone else's job. That's someone else's thing. And it's very segmented of a market then. So they don't really dive in to drive down those costs. It's incredibly hard. Elon Musk talks about building a car is hard. Building the system that builds cars is 100 times harder. It's the same way with construction. I can build you a building, but to build a system that drives and reduces the cost of those buildings is so much harder. I've got some scars to prove it.
Yeah, but if you build the systems and you get the systems right, then it's basically makes everything easy. So it's like you're building infrastructure as opposed to like kind of building individual unit. You're basically you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then if we can scale that up nationwide, we can actually have a meaningful impact on housing prices.
So where does this all fit into the if basically you can if you can create houses for cheaper and better quality, what does that do? Does the property value still, like when you go to market, is it still the same? Is it undervalued? So, or is it like you hire you to construct this building, you get a purchase, and basically the difference is your profit?
Yeah. So all of our stuff is market priced at the moment. And I should mention too, even though we're a lower cost, we still have some of the nicest properties. For example, we're producing right now a $100 million project in Minnesota. It's going to be one of the nicest apartment buildings in the entire state. But what we do is you use those profits to blow back into producing and building up the infrastructure. The infrastructure is tremendously expensive, but that's how we fund it, is through those profits. Now, our goal in the long term is to scale up the infrastructure to be producing units at such a rate that supply and demand factors actually start to reduce the market price of housing. And that's when you get affordable housing in a sustainable market-based way.
Oh, interesting. Because a lot of you know, if I were a politician or in city hall and I hear housing prices, because basically property taxes are a tax on wealth, and it's also a revenue generator for the city, so for schools, etc. So for you to come in and have the housing market lower, would you expect any sort of backlash or fighting from regulators and politicians?
In today's market, no. Everyone wants more affordable housing, it feels like. I guess I could imagine in a world in 20 years where we really scale this thing up, or in 10 years, that people get a little upset that housing is no longer always going up, if we can actually have a meaningful impact. So yeah, I could see some backlash, but certainly not anytime soon. It's the opposite right now.
Interesting. Yeah. So we talk about affordable housing, and now so where do you see the real estate market? There's so much debate. People say keep investing. Some people say bubble. How does the Federal Reserve's interest rate changes affecting development?
It's made massive changes, right? The interest rate has risen substantially. What that does in real estate is banks typically fund deals. And I'll give you our deals as an example. That $100 million project in Minnesota. Our cost on a $100 million project is $65 million, which is fantastic. A bank is typically willing to fund at $75 million. Wow. Most developers have to put money into projects. We actually pull money out of projects. Because of the interest rate environment, banks have become more cautious. And now they're only providing $55 million instead of $75 million. So now developers have to bring more money to the table. And for us, it's not a big deal because our costs are so low. For so many developers, and I just got out of a conference this morning where developers were talking about this, for so many developers, their deals don't pencil anymore, right? They were so much on the bubble, the border, that now with higher interest rates, the math just doesn't work. They can't actually give, the interest rates are actually higher than what we call cap rates, which is sort of the return on the overall project. So the equity investors get dismal of a return, and the equity investors aren't interested in that then.
Yeah, I'm talking, some of my colleague friends they're in real estate, and then they're saying, basically keeping your cost of debt low, keeping your all of your operating expenses low. Right now, we're like in a lean kind of startup environment, and basically to hedge against those increases, the cost of capital and debt, which is interesting. The other, with that, people say that with how real estate, the market kind of lags the equity market. And so equity markets, took a hit last year, and some say there's a recession looming. The inflation numbers were actually positive this morning, but what do you see like the real estate market this year, next year? Is it going to lag it? Is it going to stay stable? What are you seeing?
Yeah. So when you look at some of the stats, like new apartment starts right now is down. It's at one of the lowest levels it's been in years. And that's just recent in the last quarter. For housing inventory, the new house inventory levels are at like 9 months, which is as high as it was in 2008. And so what happens is that developers, it takes 2 years to get a project approved and completed. And so there's all these projects in the works that will continue to be in the works. So you got this supply coming on board where the demand side is softening, right? And so we're going to see, I think, housing in a tougher spot in the next year or two. And then after that, I think it's going to flip, because all the developments that are not happening now, you're going to see a lag or a shortage in a year or two. One of the things that we're doing for the investors that are involved with us is, in order to protect investors, we're actually building on a platform where people can actually earn an attractive interest rate that's independent of the real estate itself, where you can just earn a flat interest rate every single month on the money you put in. And because of the nature of our business, because our costs are so low, we can protect that money quite well and allow investors to get an attractive rate while not seeing the downside of the market.
Interesting. And wow, and then what sort of things do you do to like what sort of returns can people expect, and what sort of strategies are you using to provide that return?
Yeah, so so that $100 million project, for example, values at $100 million. Our loan on it is $55 million. What we're doing is we're opening up a window between that 55 to 65 to 75 window. So maybe $10 to $20 million for that project. We'll put money into it through this vehicle. What's nice from an investor standpoint is that real estate has to drop by 20 or 30% before they even get touched at all, right? And so we take that risky point because we trust, we can trust ourselves quite well. The investors take that middle ground where the bank takes the least risky spot. So that's the way we protect the investors. This is actually a newer platform for us. And so it actually doesn't launch until spring of this year for people to have access to it. And so the interest rates will be quite attractive, but we haven't announced what those rates will be, in part because they'll depend on the interest rate environment in 3 to 4 months.
Yeah. And so very interesting conversation. I'm always interested in hearing about what new people are doing. And as we come to the conclusion or nearing the conclusion, what's the long-term impact you hope Norhart will make on the housing industry?
One thing I think a lot about, my dad died relatively young, and I think how short life really is. So the question I ask myself is, how do I want to spend the minutes that we have here on earth? And for me, the answer to that is I've always wanted to make some kind of meaningful, positive impact in the world. And that positive impact that I think we can make in our lifetime is to drive down the cost of housing to make it more affordable for us.
Yeah, really. So that's a really powerful why. And I really enjoyed this conversation. For people listening, how can people follow you on social media, visit your website, contact you?
Yeah, our website is norhart.com. That's NORHART.com. On there, you can click and see our Invest tab, where you can learn more about the investment options and sign up for a newsletter, be the first to be allowed into that program. We also have a podcast that we're launching in a month or two that's being recorded right now on what it takes to become a unicorn or $1 billion company. And you can also connect through there onto my social media.
And for all the listeners out there, Mike's he can be followed on Facebook, LinkedIn, Insta, Twitter, and YouTube. So be sure to check those out and his website. And with that, thanks so much for coming onto the show, and thanks for providing so much value to the guests.
Yeah, thank you so much